You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by writer Dan Moore to talk about his piece in The Ringer entitled What Do Cities Lose When They Lose Pro Sports? Dan chats about why stadium deals are a bigger story about cities and how they can be harmful or potentially beneficial. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks to everyone that supports the show each month. It's super appreciated. To join this merry band of zoning nerds and infrastructure wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month gets you our bus-only scarf. And I'll be putting in an order soon for a new edition, our bike-only scarf, full of fresh Kermit. We'll also have more information soon on how to pre-order from our new batch of bus and bike-only scarves, so stay tuned. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Well, Dan Moore, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a writer based in the Bay Area, California. Born in the Bay Area, I guess, for our purposes here today, lifelong sports fan, a lifelong fan of the Bay Area sports teams, the East Bay sports team, specifically here in Oakland. And that was sort of my entry point into certain topics that I covered in the essay that you reached out to me about.
Nice. I see you have a Green Day poster too. You're definitely steeped in Bay Area culture.
Yes, sir. That's right. Early Green Day for me specifically.
Nice. Yeah, that's the cover art for Dookie, I think, right? Good album.
That's right. Good eye.
1994. Such a long time ago. Well, so how do you feel about the East Bay? I mean, how do you feel about the cities of the East Bay and, the urban area in general?
I mean, I am totally enamored of the East Bay. I think Oakland is one of the best cities in the world. I think it's one of the most fascinating cities in the world. I've been drawn to write a lot about it because I think that there are many aspects of it that, it tells a great story, I think, with a rich history from which a lot can be learned. And so, that sort of draws me to it from a storytelling perspective. But also, speaking of Oakland specifically, just everything else you hear about the place is true. It is so culturally dynamic, so much great art is still made here, so much great music. The food here is incredible. I lived in New Orleans for a while earlier in my life, and there are certain aspects of Oakland that remind me of New Orleans a little bit, from the Victorian houses that you could still see around, particularly in the West, to the same cultural richness. There's just so much to love here. It's hard to boil down an answer.
I hear you. Well, so this is a little bit outside of our usual discussions about transportation and city planning, but I thought it was an important discussion about urban pride and social capital for the most part. Mm-hmm. So you wrote a piece in The Ringer about what cities lose when they lose a sports team. And I was wondering, what sparked you to write this piece specifically? Was it the impending loss of the A's, or was it general kind of loss of sports teams over time in Oakland?
So I had been reporting for newspapers and magazines out here for a couple of years now on the exodus from Oakland of professional sports teams, and more specifically, the ongoing negotiations over the impending departure of the A's, the baseball team out here. And those centered around the proposed construction of a glittering new baseball stadium in West Oakland, right on the waterfront. And wrapped up in that story, both the opposition to the stadium plan, the back and forth over who pays for what, the people who are very much in favor of the stadium construction, the fans, it sort of swirling in that is a much larger story about why people love sports, what good they can do for a place, and also what harm they can cause a place, and what harm bad or one-sided stadium deals can have on a city's built environment and on its culture and on its economy. And so both at a sort of a ground level, there's a lot of interesting stuff to report on. But again, maybe at a higher level, this story is a microcosm of something that I felt was probably interesting just from a general sports fans, or as someone who's interested in cities generally. I thought there was a lot of interest there for people who don't even know about Oakland, really.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, let's chat a little bit about some history. I mean, there's a long history of sports teams leaving cities. Before, Oakland, it's really nothing new. I mean, the Giants and the Dodgers came from New York. But, in the modern era, the threat of movement actually has kind of come up a lot of times. And I think the first one that comes to people's minds, especially when they're talking about people threatening leaving cities, is the Baltimore Colts leaving to Indianapolis.
Yeah.
What changed in terms of the overall landscape in cities and in sports when the Colts left for Indianapolis?
I think twofold. First, it sort of proved to team owners that they had license to effectively extort city governments to provide them with massive public subsidies that could in turn translate to beautiful new stadiums that have often proven very profitable for team owners. And so from 1984, when that happened, you sort of see this wave of team owners holding cities, over a barrel and saying, hey, we need lots of public money to build a stadium, or we are going to take our services and our team elsewhere. I mean, that happens to this day. It's almost as if, it's more surprising when a team owner at some point does not do that to try to get a new stadium out of the city that they live in, than when team owners are somehow more humble. Or rather, it's rare to not see it now. So that is sort of the first thing that you really see happening there. The second thing, of course, is you see cities starting to acquiesce and build tons of new stadiums. I think in baseball alone, in Baltimore, after the Colts left, the city government was galvanized into action to say, we don't want to let the rest of our teams leave. And so what you see is they end up building this admittedly beautiful new stadium for the Orioles. Then they also built a new stadium for the Ravens, who I think were an expansion team who came their way. But so you see all over the sports landscape, the construction of these massive, massive new stadiums all over the place. And so Baltimore really kind of kicked that off, both a relocation and threatening spree on the part of team owners and this new construction boom, both of which have proven often largely expensive or very expensive for cities.
Well, that's what it feels like. It feels like it's super expensive for cities, and they're often left holding the bag when it comes to paying for these things. We know about, what's happened in Oakland, where, the bond measure that was passed, and they're almost done paying that off for getting the Raiders back from Southern California, even though the Raiders are already gone now, right? It's not even, they haven't even finished paying for that. You have, Stan Kroenke leaving St. Louis and going to Los Angeles. And it's not just football and baseball. I mean, it's all these other places where they kind of threaten to leave. Mm-hmm. But is it mostly an American construct? Because I don't really necessarily see Real Madrid leaving Madrid, or, Barcelona threatening to leave Barcelona, or Bayern Munich threatening a new stadium thing. Is this an American construct?
As I understand it, it is rather uniquely American. One reason has to do with the fact that in Europe, particularly in soccer, the idea of a club is more elementally rooted in the community from which, the club sprung up. You almost never see relocation in Europe. I mean, you certainly see the construction of big new stadiums, but you don't see, the owners of Real Madrid trying to extort their local governments to give them lots of money under the threat of leaving.
They do it other ways.
Sure, right. But you're totally right that it doesn't really happen elsewhere. And I think the reason has to do with this more vaguely capitalistic conception of what pro sports teams are that's taken root here versus the more vaguely collectivist conception that is common in Europe, where, the teams are often, they're really rooted in the communities there in a different way.
I think that's why the Super League didn't take off, right? I mean, there was a big push to create a super soccer league in Europe, and a lot of the club's fans freaked out and said, we don't want this. You're going to leave the Premier League, you're going to leave the La Liga, et cetera,
right,
to go to other places and to build a different league. And the fans were so up in arms about it that they cut it out real quick, which was really fascinating from that standpoint. I always think about this too in terms of the capitalist versus a more socialist sports structure. I always feel like the American sports is actually more socialist than European sports in terms of like how the structures of the businesses work. I mean, it's a closed system in the US, and even MLS and soccer is a closed system. They're fighting pro-rel, promotion and relegation, tooth and nail to try to not let anybody else in. And at the same time, in Europe, I mean, they have, fair play statutes and things like that. But for the most part, I mean, you have the big clubs owned by the big owners spending billions and billions of dollars untethered to reality to a certain extent. So it's interesting to think of the capitalist instinct from a stadium and movement perspective, but also the socialist instinct from a let's close our system and make sure that only we are equal in terms of our league, sharing revenue, et cetera.
Right. What you have in America, especially in the four major sports, is the leagues are essentially run like cartels in that, like you said, they're closed. The market effectively for those leagues is totally controlled. Team owners don't let new teams in, or rather they, have control over the competition. And so it adds a, kind of perverse element to it, especially when you think about the way here in America, we have so willingly given ourselves over to these leagues. And I think we are probably getting better at it now and standing up for ourselves and for our cities and for our public tax dollars a little bit more. And I think that's also exemplified in Oakland too. But you go back, especially to the 90s, when this craze of team owners relishing in their newfound power and their newfound, ability to manipulate state and city governments, when cities were just laying down and giving, these really kind of very lucrative stadium deals, team owners, we seemed to just totally say to these cartels, okay, we will do what you want. We'll build what you want. Just don't move your team.
What do the teams hold over cities? I mean, I'm thinking about this in the way of like, if you're talking about an electorate and voters, right? The sports teams are so ingrained in city culture that it's hard for a city to say no when these teams say that they want to leave. I mean, if you think about the Raiders and how, entrenched they were in Oakland, but also in Los Angeles, I mean, there's a lot of folks in LA that still are Raiders fans from the time that they were there, and they'll never give that up. And how much does that influence how much power these teams have over cities, that culture that's created, that loyalty, the ability to even get out voters to vote for some of these stadium deals?
Yeah, I think that plays a big role. I think there are largely two things that come to mind. The first is team owners know how important their teams can be to the populace of a place. And that's real. The sports teams do confer a lot of intangible value to a place. They inspire pride, they create community, they create bonds, both within the community and also within families. One thing in my piece in The Ringer that I heard time and time again in the conversations I have with fans was how important it was for them to be able to take their kids to an A's game one day, and how important it had been when they were kids to be able to go to an A's game with their parents. And so all that's real. Team owners know that. Team owners know the power that they have over cities to that end, and they wield it. And so that's one. Another is there's a perception, I think, that is very strong, particularly in a place like Oakland, maybe to a lesser extent, but you think about maybe like mid-tier cities where having a pro team seems to suggest something about them, that they are a major league city, that they are worthy of pro teams and deserve to be in that discussion. And so that creates another kind of power that team owners use in these negotiations too. On the other side, it very much powers the desire of other cities who, like a Las Vegas, and they say, we want your football team, we want that status, we'll give you $750 million in public funding to acquire it. And so I think those are a few of the levers that team owners use.
It's interesting that they're so aspirational in that way. I remember I grew up in Houston, and the Oilers were a big thing, and then they left to go to Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And before that, you didn't as a kid anyways, I didn't hear much about Tennessee, but then you hear about Tennessee. And so you think of these places that get a sports team and they come into your consciousness. It's almost like college football where the universities are basically fronting these teams to be big advertisements for the school.
Right.
And using them as a way to kind of create that aspiration for people to want to go there. It's interesting to think about it from that perspective, from a city perspective, from a Nashville or other, mid-tier cities like you're talking about. I'm wondering how many of those investments that they made in these stadiums actually, turned out from that perspective of making their profiles bigger on a national or even international stage.
Yeah. And I think there certainly are examples of it working out that way. I think of Oklahoma City, for example, which if you set aside sort of the shady way that they acquired the formerly Seattle Supersonics, Sam Anderson writes about this in Boomtown, his excellent book on Oklahoma City, where the Thunder, when they began to exist in Oklahoma City, they played a key role in a renaissance or a revival campaign of downtown Oklahoma City. And that arena that was built there is positioned in the book, at any rate. I haven't been to Oklahoma City, but it is sort of the centerpiece of that revival initiative. You look at a place like San Francisco or San Diego as well, where the new stadium that San Francisco built for the Giants, that inarguably succeeded in improving and beautifying and revivifying that part of the city. And so that potential is very real too. And you do see that happening. And that's what Oakland, I think, wants more than anything else. The political leaders who are fighting to keep the A's and who are fighting to greenlight the stadium, they want to maintain that sense of major league status, everything that we've talked about so far, but they also very much want to revitalize that pocket of downtown. And stadiums can be a vehicle of doing that. And by virtue of that fact, pro teams can be a vehicle of doing that. Can being a key word. It doesn't always quite work out like that. Often it doesn't, but I think that's another piece of it.
It's interesting to think about the chicken and egg effect of that too. I mean, I feel like cities generally have been, revitalizing or gentrifying or displacing people since the 90s in this kind of back to downtown movement. And you have to question whether, say, like the Giant Stadium was actually the catalyst, or it was just kind of the first piece in an already falling line of dominoes. The idea that these stadiums are kind of the catalyst is really interesting to think about. And I'm sure there's been plenty of research done on this, whether the stadium was actually the catalyst or whether it was just a result of kind of headwinds going in that direction already.
I think that's totally fair. And the majority of research, which I became familiarized with in part through writing this piece, in fact, suggests the opposite of what you might be getting at, is that often stadiums themselves don't have, at least it's difficult to attribute directly to stadiums much of an economic impact. It seems rare that you find a stadium that you can point to and say, this inspired even a net positive effect on the local economy here. I guess I bring up San Francisco and a place like San Diego from more of like an eyeball test where like you look at before and after pictures of even when the stadium was being built in San Diego. For example, this picture was making its rounds on Twitter recently. It showed downtown San Diego right before the stadium was built, and it showed it today. And, it's a meaningful difference. The place looks totally different. And so, yeah, I think it's very difficult to attribute that to the stadiums itself. But certainly, I think that, that unscientific eyeball test, that holds sway in people's minds. And I think that is one thing that's definitely in people's minds here in Oakland as they look across the bay to China Basin, where the Giant Stadium is. And, studies be damned, they look at it and they say, I want that. We want that for Oakland.
Right. It's also interesting for these sports team owners that it's no longer just good enough to own a team and build a stadium and make money off of that. It has to be a real estate deal, and it has to be, building hotels and conference centers and residential real estate. So like at Howard Terminal, which is where the A's want to build their stadium, it's not just a stadium deal. It seems like it's more than that. And I think that that's the direction that many of these owners have going, because I think that they've realized that they've siphoned off as much as they could siphon off with sports teams alone. They go into mogul status where they want to try to become real estate masters. And I think that is kind of the way of things as well these days. And the stadium is a piece of it, but then it gets the piece of the pie that they want is larger.
I think first to put it into perspective, in Oakland, the anticipated construction costs for this project, the waterfront ballpark project, The stadium itself is anticipated to cost $1 billion. But the total of the real estate development project as conceived in the project plans is somewhere around $12 billion. And so, what opponents of this are saying is that the stadium is sort of like a Trojan horse that's really designed to allow John Fisher, the owner of the A's, to create this likely massively lucrative real estate little town on, the West Oakland waterfront there. And so you're totally right that that's the larger trend that we're seeing. And I think that skeptics of the A's out here are pointing to that and saying, this isn't about the A's. This isn't really about baseball. It is about creating a massive and, again, likely very lucrative real estate development on some of the most profitable property in the country, that waterfront right on the bay there.
It's interesting what that place is now. It's a container terminal. The area around it, West Oakland, is historically disadvantaged. Also, if you take a BART train over, and I do every Wednesday to go visit my family in the East Bay, if you take the train, you see out the windows kind of what the situation is in California that a lot of folks are complaining about. What does it mean for the neighborhood overall if this happens? Is it going to get people displaced? Is it going to change their fortunes in a positive direction? Which way is it going to go?
Well,
or both, maybe.
It's hard to say. I think that the answer would probably be both. I think when you talk to people who live in West Oakland, and when you talk to people in Chinatown and in the surrounding communities there, what you just described is a massive concern. And for them, that is their foremost reason for opposing the project, really. I think that from what I've read, large scale public-private construction projects like this, they exacerbate or worsen certain issues that just happen to be in Oakland, the most sincerely felt issues happening right now: gentrification, displacement, homelessness. There's a world where this project gets built and it totally changes the surrounding area, and everyone who lives there now is disregarded and is displaced, and that could be bad for those people. And I think that the people who live there now are the ones that I've spoken with. They're very concerned about that, in addition to things like increased pollution, for example, in addition to just the affordability of the area and gentrification and things like that. To give the people negotiating the project or negotiating the developer agreement between the city and the A's credit, there is a world where they can win an agreement that takes appreciable mitigative measures to that end, where the A's are compelled to create a meaningful amount of affordable housing, or to, for among the billions of dollars of condos and apartments that are going to be created, maybe there's a world where it could be negotiated where enough of that is affordable to, offset some of that damage that you speak of and predict. That, I think, is making up the lion's share of the disagreement between the two parties right now. But I do believe there are folks fighting for that. I don't exactly have the answer so far as how it's going to turn out. I think it is crucial that the people who are working on, who are negotiating this, don't sell out the West Oakland community and the Chinatown community, because it's precisely as you say, it could be very damaging.
It's also interesting to think about all of the opposition that's going against the plans, not just here, but around the country. I mean, before in the 90s and the 2000s, it felt like these plans were really easy to get done, right? And now it seems a little bit harder. And I think part of, in California, the thing that happened was Jerry Brown got rid of redevelopment. That helped a lot, I think, in terms of giving people a way to push back on some of these deals and make owners pay more for the stadium than having taxpayers do it. Obviously, we have these infrastructure TIF type things now that allow, cities to kind of set up for not just stadiums and this real estate thing, but any development that got restructured after redevelopment disappeared. I'm wondering, though, what is the nature of dissent, as it were, people pushing back? And do you think you'll see more pushback around the country from people who are tired of giving these billionaires more billions?
Certainly. I think that you've seen it in pockets. I wrote something for a magazine out here called The Oakland Side last summer about the community benefits agreement that a variety of stakeholders from within Oakland are working on right now. And that will eventually be tied to any developer agreement that's agreed to or not agreed to by the A's in the city. And if you look at other CBAs that have been negotiated and won across the country, there are examples of CBAs that have pushed back against one-sided development deals and that have effectively protected those communities from those developments damaging effects. It has happened in Pittsburgh and a few other examples. And I think that's an important weapon that communities have in their back pockets. And I think that one shift that you see a little bit is that in more of these development deals, there are CBAs that are tied to them. And if they are specific and if they have teeth, they can be effective. I think that the opposition that you see in Oakland, maybe opposition is the wrong word, the skepticism that you see from people who are like on the CBA steering committee for this project here in Oakland, they hope to use the CBA to protect communities against pollution, against gentrification. They want to ensure that spoils from the project, down the line, go not only to John Fisher and the A's, but that, Oakland itself can see material benefits from this, as is an important part of the pitch, as it stands right now. And so, the opposition, the concern is rooted in much of what we've been talking about here. I guess one point is we should make sure to pay attention to the CBA. And if the CBA that is eventually tied to this deal is something that people in the community are happy with, and they say, yes, we believe in this, that could be a good sign, I think. I personally have my doubts about whether John Fisher and the A's are prepared to agree to a CBA that is so agreeable to the community, but I suppose we'll have to wait and see.
It's funny when you say CBA, I consistently think not communities benefit agreement, but collective bargaining agreement, and something that sports teams go through a lot with their players and whatnot.
Right.
I feel like I've been a little bit negative, and I don't mean to be, because I love the A's. I mean, I have a picture from my sister's wedding of me with a red nose because we went to an A's game, the day before.
Nice.
And so there's history there. And I do, love Oakland as well. I feel like I worked there for 8 years. I feel like I connected, go to a lot of First Fridays and things like that. But what happens, if the A's leave? Is it a roots town now? Is it going to be a place where, the soccer team thrives and collects all of the folks that, felt wronged by all of the teams that have left them?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that the Roots are a great organization. And I do think that if the A's were to leave, you would probably see, there's already lots of momentum and excitement about the Roots in Oakland, but you would see that probably increase. You would likely also see renewed vigor around embracing the Roots and maybe even building them a new stadium, just because there would be a newfound appreciation both for a team that wants to be here, but also, a sense like, okay, well, we need to rally around something. If the A's were to leave, some good could happen. There is very well, the Bay Area is like the 6th largest television market in the country.
Huge amount of people, 7 million people in the region from, Oakland, San Jose, San Francisco.
The East Bay alone has 2 or 3 million, I think. I find it hard to believe that if the A's were to leave, some other ownership group wouldn't seize this opportunity and potentially even build at the Coliseum site. I think Dave Stewart, who is an old A's player, his organization has expressed interest in buying the Coliseum site. My larger point is, if the A's leave, I think yes, Oakland becomes in the interim a roots town so far as sports goes. But I would believe that somebody else, another ownership group, would try to bring a team here, be it an expansion team or some other kind of relocation. There's just so many people here, and Oakland is such a great sports town. I mentioned this in the piece. At one time, it was referred to commonly as the greatest sports city in the nation. I find it hard to believe that people wouldn't want to try their hand here or seize that opportunity. And I guess while we're talking about the Coliseum site in deep East Oakland, the A's are adamant that that is not a viable site for a new stadium. I bet you would see people who would be willing to test that theory.
That doesn't make any sense, honestly, that it's not a viable place. It has BART access, it has freeway access for those who like to drive to games. There's a huge amount of space to do their parking lot and all of the tailgating that goes on for games. It seems ridiculous that it's not a viable site. I feel like it's only not viable in their minds because they have an impression of place that Oaklanders don't have, but maybe the ownership has because of their preconceived, maybe negativity is the wrong word, but you know what I'm saying. Just kind of like a notion.
Yeah, and I think that in the context of baseball stadiums, especially, there is historical precedent and a kind of romantic desiring for the downtown urban garden ballpark. And so it's hard to blame the A's for, and it's hard to blame Oakland even, for getting excited about the idea of a downtown jewel box park, like the ballparks of old that are sort of built into the fabric of the city. That's something that excites me as, someone who interested in cities and who loves baseball. That said, the idea that the Oakland Coliseum site is a bad site for sports is I agree. I don't think that that's correct. One could make the argument that it will be much, much easier if the A's do build a stadium at the Howard Terminal site. One could argue that it will remain infinitely easier to get to the Coliseum than it ever would be to get to Howard Terminal, which is a mile from any BART stop and, which is only accessible through presently sidewalkless side streets right now. There's so much opportunity on that Coliseum site. All the infrastructure for a stadium is obviously already there. In addition to the, means of access you described, there's also an airport with a BART connection to the airport that leads right to the Coliseum. There's an Amtrak station right there. With a little love and care, that could be a hub of sports love that also succeeds in reviving East Oakland in the manner that everyone who is invested in the West Oakland ballpark project, promises will happen there. And so you could see revival in the area around the Coliseum too, if someone invested in it the right way.
You mentioned earlier kind of the family aspect of things. I'm curious more about that. You have the supporters groups that you talked to for the article. There's a lot of folks, obviously, that are tied to the A's. I know a certain BART supervisor who goes to games frequently with their wife. It's tied to people and place here in the Bay Area, especially in Oakland. I'm curious what their kind of outlook was, for the listeners, how they're feeling about this as people who are deeply embedded in the culture of the A's and of sports in Oakland generally.
My read on it is a majority of the folks that I've talked to who have that kind of elemental tie to and love for the A's in particular, the people whose concern is foremost the A's want them to stay, and they don't really much care how that happens. A lot of those people are frustrated and confused with the A's reluctance to build at the Coliseum site, but they are willing to get behind the Howard Terminal proposal because it serves preeminently in their minds as a means of keeping the A's in town. That seems, for people who care most about the A's, that is their main motivation, at least from the folks that I've spoken with. There's also a subset of fans who are sort of disgusted with the A's behavior of late, the behavior of the A's owners, rather.
On the field too. I mean, not just this stadium thing, but how they're putting players on the field and the product that they're putting out there generally.
It feels to me that the relationship between a city and a team comes down so much to the motivations and beneficence of team owners. If a team owner wants there to be a good relationship, if they want to proudly represent and be a positive force for the community, then you see that and you feel that, and that is oftentimes what happens. What you're seeing with the A's right now is sort of the exact opposite. It feels like they're holding this community asset hostage, and they are taunting fans and starving the asset as a means of trying to get what they want. And I think that is creating a lot of distaste in the hearts of fans who I think know what pro teams can be and can do, and who know how great and how beneficial the A's have been to Oakland when they've been invested in properly, and what that experience can be like at the Coliseum. One thinks of the late 80s when the Haas family owned the A's, and they marketed the team and they spent money on great players, and they made improvements to the Coliseum and the in-game experience. Not only were the A's great, and not only did they inspire lots of love within Oakland and out, but the A's ranked tops in the major leagues in attendance for 5 years in a row. And so it feels fair to say that much of what you're seeing in Oakland now, and certainly the low attendance now, is a product not of bad fans, but of bad treatment and disinvestment on the part of the owners.
It's interesting to think about that in the context of what's going on kind of nationally in places like Cincinnati, where some of their ownership and their, general manager has contempt for the fans. And I think I see this in European soccer as well. When the owners and the fans don't get along very well, there's airplanes in the air and banners and so out, right, is the usual cry from fans. And I think it's interesting to think from a fan perspective, like what they would do if they felt like, if a fan had $1 billion and bought a team, like what they would do, and if they saw it as a business or if they saw it as something that they just loved and wanted to give back to the community. It's interesting to think about all these owners that see it as a business versus the owners that see it as kind of their baby or their lifelong love, and how they treat it, treat the fans, treat the players, treat the cities that they're in.
Yeah. Or team owners who understand that this asset that they own, the team, is not just a means of making money, although teams prove incredibly profitable for most team owners. What they have is something that matters to the community. And I think that, it's a community asset. And when you have team owners who not only love the sport that, they are invested in, and not only care about the success of their on the field product, but who appreciate, what their product means to the community, you see the difference.
What's next? What's next for Oakland generally? Do you think the A's will stay, or do you think they'll go? What's your gut feeling?
Well, there are a couple consequential dates coming up. On June 30th, the San Francisco Bay Conservation District, SFVCDC, an agency charged with governing the waterfront there, is going to hold a formal vote as to whether they are going to greenlight eliminating maritime use at the Howard Terminal site. If they vote not to, that would effectively mean that the A's cannot build there. And from what, John Fisher and Dave Kaval, the A's presidents, have made abundantly clear, if they're not able to build there, they're going to move the team likely to Las Vegas. So we may find out on June 30th if that municipal body says the A's can't, we have to keep this a port. That's what Howard Terminal is right now. It's part of the Port of Oakland. Then I think it's almost a foregone conclusion at that point that the A's would leave. If that agency says, yes, you can turn this into a stadium, I think that by this point, all parties involved, from the A's to, Oakland city government, have invested so much time and have so much on the line that I find it hard to believe that either side would at this point let the project die over relatively small disagreements. So for example, the A's are spending millions and millions of dollars in this effort to fund environmental impact reviews and to conduct these negotiations and all that. They want this to happen. Obviously, of course, they see the potential revenues that might come from having a privately owned stadium in this spot, along with all the real estate development. So they want it to happen. For all the reasons we discussed earlier, the pressures on the Oakland city government to not let another team leave, to no longer be seen as a major league city, the desire to want to provide, to keep this for fans, all that is real. They want this to happen. I would say that for those reasons, the project will move forward. Now, the one thing that could happen is, not much is known about John Fisher other than the fact that he's incredibly frugal. It could come to pass that even if the project is greenlit from the state level and they say, okay, you can go ahead and build here. Let's say the steering committee for the CBA puts forth and, finalizes a community benefits agreement that would require the A's to be too generous or more generous than John Fisher wants to be. I could potentially see him deciding to walk away from the deal at that point. My hope, as someone who loves Oakland and has spent, a lot of time in the community talking with people there, is that CBA is strong and that, all the interests of that part of Oakland as it exists now are accounted for and represented and fought for. I hope that it is hard for the A's. I hope that they do invest meaningfully in the community, in part to mitigate some of the deleterious effects of large-scale development. But again, we'll see. So roundabout way, long-winded way of answering your question. I do think it moves forward, except I hope that it moves forward the right way.
Yeah, understandable. Well, the article is What Do Cities Lose When They Lose Pro Sports in The Ringer. Dan, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Jeffrey. Thanks so much.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.